Ta-Nehisi Coates is an American author, journalist, and educator. Growing up, his mother was a teacher and his father was a Vietnam veteran and also a former Black Panther. So Coates mainly writes about the social, political, and economic issues that surround the African American community. He is the author of We Are 8 Years in Power, which is the book that we are going to be summarizing today. The book is interesting because the structure is set during the 8 years of Obama's presidency. So Coates took 8 collective essays that he wrote in each year of Obama's presidency and included an introductory chapter that summarizes what he was thinking at the time and also how his views have changed since the time he wrote each of those essays. The first chapter of We Are 8 Years in Power is called This Is How We Lost the White Man. And in this chapter, Coates tries to find the boundary between integration and keeping to your roots. And Coates explains how Obama and other men regulate these boundaries, specifically how Obama has what he calls split languages, one that appeals to the white majority and one that appeals to the Black community. And he doesn't identify this as a bad trait. He thinks that it helps Obama be able to communicate effectively in any environment, which is a good attribute for the president to have. Coates also discusses his early days as a writer when he was very afraid of failure and the inability to support his family, and he credits almost all of his success to the election of Barack Obama. And so the theme of Black success is prevalent throughout the whole chapter, specifically when he speaks of the famous Bill Cosby's pound cake speech. And in the speech, he attacks African American naming traditions, the style that young Blacks dress, and almost every stereotype that Blacks have nowadays. And Coates wants to challenge Cosby's pound cake speech, and he believes that instead of focusing on the acts that African Americans should focus on the impact of white supremacy. And he believes that arguments like Cosby's completely ignore the impact of history on the current situation of African Americans.
Chapter 2 summary. It begins with the author, Coates, and he talks about the wonder that came about when Barack Obama won his presidency, and that it gave hope that white supremacy might one day be banished in the United States in Coates' lifetime. He also mentioned how people felt a need to explain how and why Barack Obama won his presidency, and their explanation was his multiracial background. And it's interesting because many times individuals do not see a need to explain when a person of color does something negative. Like if a person of color is a drug dealer, they won't necessarily try to find a reason why. That person's Black, he's a drug dealer, and that's normal. But when a person of color does something amazing, like becomes the president of the United States, there needs to be some sort of explanation. And I thought that was really interesting. He talks about how segregation or separation protects, in a sense, which sounds, when I first read it, I was like, what? But it's sort of true because when one lives with only the other, they don't feel like they are the other. But the issue occurs when one is not prepared for the real world, where they will be seen as the other.
In the third chapter, titled Why Do So Few Blacks Study the Civil War, Coates reminisces on how, with the use of his blog, he got really interested in the Civil War and actually becomes a huge Civil War enthusiast. He also shed lights on the fact that rarely is a Civil War told from the slave point of view, and instead it's told from the Confederate victims, like in Gone with the Wind and Birth of a Nation. So by the end of the chapter, Coates basically just tells African Americans to reclaim the Civil War as their own.
The fourth chapter of We Are 8 Years in Power is called The Legacy of Malcolm X, Why His Vision Lives On in Barack Obama. In this chapter, Coates speaks about the intergenerational effects of slavery and white supremacy on the Black community. And Coates feels the inherent struggle that motivates this article is the skepticism of the American government, similar to Malcolm X's skepticism, and also his natural hope that he has for the Obama administration. In this chapter, he reviews Manning Marable's biography of Malcolm X, and it's titled Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention. And Coates focuses on the importance of Malcolm X and the fact that he was a model for Black self-fashioning and attempts to establish some type of parallel between the career of Malcolm X and Barack Obama. And he speaks about the Black Pride movement, and specifically about how women, especially his mother, stopped perming their hair and they let their natural hair grow into afros. Before the Black Pride movement, the hate for Blacks made even Blacks despise themselves. Coates also speaks about how Malcolm felt that his ambitions were ultimately capped because his idea of self-invention and self-creation had limits then. Malcolm X always felt like he would be a great lawyer, but he wasn't able to fulfill his desires in that time period. And compared to Barack Obama, he was able to become a lawyer and he made himself president, especially coming from a single parent household. And these things give Coates hope about the Obama administration and the future of the American government.
In the 5th chapter, Coates introduces the next chapter or article, which was titled Fear of a Black President, and he introduces it by coming to terms with the great responsibility and advantage that he has as a black writer who focuses on race. He then dives into Obama's presidency during the Trayvon Martin shooting, which exemplifies how Obama had to be twice as good and half as black, as he calls it, during his presidency, and how him commenting on the Trayvon Martin shooting led to a huge flip in seeing Zimmerman, who was the man who shot Martin, changing the perspective from seeing him as a murderer to a victim, actually. And Coates basically attributes this to the fact that the U.S. is still not ready to see a black man as president.
The 6th chapter of We Are 8 Years in Power is called The Case for Reparations, and in this chapter, Coates describes his ideas of how whites don't have to bear the full ancestral load of slavery, and in some ways their burden has vanished. However, he feels that the African American community, all generations, are forever condemned to carry the weight of slavery. He speaks about the flaws of the average analysis of the struggles that African Americans face, specifically how people disregard the historical and contemporary impact of white supremacy and segregation in African American progress. And Coates speaks to the government's ineffective use of colorblind and class-based policies, like programs that were put in place. They were originally for whites, like the New Deal, Social Security, unemployment, and blacks were excluded originally from these wealth-building opportunities, and he feels that over time these resources accrued for whites and led to a clear demarcation of discrimination that was observable in the wealthiness of blacks. And Coates believes that the conversation about reparations will help address some of these issues. Previously, the claims for reparations were based on the slave ancestors of these African Americans today, but Coates wants to switch that argument, and he wants to talk about the valid intergenerational effects that slavery had also, and he wants to make that a more valid argument for reparations instead of simply people wanting reparations for their ancestors.
Okay, so chapter 7, how racism is essential to America and how it is a building block. It is and has been a building block for what the United States is. And he talks about how separatist nationalism is flawed for Black America because in order to have a separatist society, one needs aid and graces from the oppressor. He talks about what it's like to be a Black writer today and how it appealed to him because of the questions that it brings up about our age and the age in which we live. And if you read anything, any part of Between the Road and Me, this section's pretty interesting because he talks about the behind the scenes of writing that and how Baldwin impacted him very much. Okay, so in chapter 8 of Coates, it begins with a quote of Obama saying that Trump can't win, which is ironic. And it talks about how Obama, in saying this, had the point of view of an immigrant and of a Black person in America. And now America is seen as, in many ways, it's seen as a place of wonder. And I think these things might not necessarily happen, but they do, and they did. Coates also talks about the contradictions of having a Black person in the United States as the president. And he wrote about a little bit more about Barack Obama's history and his love of basketball and how that relates to Black culture and how he felt growing up. He felt that being Black was cool, and he talked about his positive relations with white members of his family and other types of identities, other types of people in his life growing up. And he mentioned how Obama was not competing against other Black Americans, but now representing them. And he mentions, which is very interesting and beautiful, that Obama's formula for closing the split between Black and white America is, or was, creating policy for all of America.